The blade was meant for the child. In a heartbeat, she stepped between death and innocence, her body a shield against cold steel. As crimson bloomed across silk, the Duke of Ashford, a man who had never known warmth, felt something shatter within his chest. For 3 years, he had treated her as nothing more than a contractual obligation, a womb to carry his heir. Now, as she collapsed into his arms, her blood staining his hands, he understood with devastating clarity the woman he had ignored was the only one who had ever truly loved him. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments which part of the world you're listening from. I want to know how far it has traveled. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Ashford Manor with the same indifference that characterized everything within its walls. Eleanor Ashford stood before her dressing table, her lady's maid fastening the last pearl button at her collar. The reflection staring back at her was composed, elegant, and utterly alone. 3 years had passed since her wedding day. 3 years since her father, a respected but financially struggling baronet, had secured her future by arranging her marriage to Sebastian Ashford, the Duke of Ashford. It had been presented as an extraordinary match, a baron's daughter elevated to duchess. What no one mentioned was that Sebastian Ashford had needed a wife of good breeding to silence society's whispers about his reclusive nature, and Eleanor had needed her family's debts erased. The transaction had been clean, efficient, and loveless. "Will His Grace be joining you for breakfast, Your Grace?" her maid asked softly. Eleanor's lips curved into a practiced smile. "I suspect not, Mary. The Duke breakfasts in his study when he's in residence." When he's in residence, the words tasted bitter. Sebastian spent more time at his London townhouse or touring his northern estates than he did at Ashford Manor. When he was present, he was a ghost, a tall, dark-haired spectre who moved through corridors without seeing her, who spoke in clipped tones about household matters and nothing more. She had fulfilled her primary duty 18 months ago, when she delivered his son, Thomas. The birth had been difficult, leaving her weak for months. Sebastian had visited the nursery precisely once, gazed upon his heir with satisfaction, and returned to his self-imposed isolation. He had not visited her chambers since. Eleanor descended the grand staircase, her hand trailing along the banister that gleamed with fresh polish. Everything in Ashford Manor gleamed. The servants were efficient, the grounds immaculate, the accounts perfectly balanced. It was a house without fault and without heart. The breakfast room overlooked the rose garden, though the October morning had stripped most of the blooms. Eleanor took her seat at the long table, accepting tea from the footman. The chair at the head of the table remained empty, as it did most mornings. She had tried in the beginning. She had attempted conversation, had dressed carefully for dinners, had expressed interest in his estates and investments. Sebastian had responded with polite distance, answering her questions with minimal words before retreating behind his newspaper or his correspondence. The other ladies of her acquaintance pitied her, she knew. At social gatherings, the few she attended without her husband, they would lean close with sympathetic eyes. "The Duke is so very serious," they would murmur, "so very cold." They didn't understand that cold was preferable to cruelty. Sebastian was never unkind. He simply didn't see her at all. "Your Grace, a letter has arrived from London." The butler, Morrison, presented a silver tray. Eleanor recognized her cousin Beatrice's enthusiastic handwriting immediately. Beatrice, who had married for love to a country vicar, who wrote letters full of warmth and laughter and small domestic joys. Eleanor broke the seal, hungry for that warmth. The letter was an invitation. Beatrice's sister-in-law, Lady Catherine Hartley, was hosting a month-long house party at her estate in Kent. "Do come, dearest Eleanor," Beatrice had written. "You've been buried in that draughty manor for far too long. Lady Catherine is wonderfully unconventional. She hosts artists and writers alongside the usual society set. It would do you good to have some society." Eleanor set down the letter, her heart beating faster. A month away from Ashford Manor. A month of conversation and companionship. A month of being seen. She would need Sebastian's permission, of course. The thought made her throat tighten. He would likely grant it with the same indifference he showed everything concerning her, but she would still need to ask. That evening she requested an audience in his study. Sebastian Ashford sat behind his massive desk, his dark hair slightly dishevelled from running his hands through it, a habit he had when deep in concentration. At 32, he was handsome in a severe way, all sharp angles and penetrating grey eyes. Those eyes lifted to her now with mild surprise. "Eleanor, is something wrong with Thomas?" "Always Thomas, never her." "Thomas is well, Your Grace. I've come to request your permission to accept an invitation." She explained about the house party, keeping her voice steady and reasonable. Sebastian listened without expression. When she finished, he nodded once. "Of course, the change will do you good. You've seemed pale lately." Had he noticed? The observation startled her. "I'll arrange for the carriage and appropriate staff to accompany you," he continued, already returning his attention to his papers. "Morrison can coordinate the details." "Thank you, Your Grace." She turned to leave, then paused at the door. Some reckless impulse made her speak. Would you consider joining me, even for a few days? Lady Catherine's gatherings are said to be quite interesting." Sebastian didn't look up. "I have business in Manchester that cannot be postponed." "Enjoy your holiday, Eleanor." Dismissed, always dismissed. As she climbed the stairs to her chambers, Eleanor felt the familiar ache of loneliness settle around her shoulders like a shawl. She paused outside the nursery, listening to Thomas's delighted laughter as his nurse played with him. At least her son would know love, even if his father remained forever distant. She didn't see Sebastian standing in the shadows of the corridor below, watching her silhouette against the lamplight, his expression unreadable. Lady Catherine Hartley's estate, Willowmere, was everything Ashford Manor was not. Warm, slightly chaotic, filled with laughter and spirited debate. Eleanor felt herself unfold like a flower in unexpected sunshine. The house party included an eclectic mix: a celebrated poet, a Scottish botanist, several young couples, and a handful of society's more progressive thinkers. Beatrice had been right. It was wonderfully unconventional. On the fifth evening, Lady Catherine organized an elaborate masquerade ball. The ballroom glittered with candlelight, and guests swirled in costumes ranging from Elizabethan splendor to exotic Eastern silks. Eleanor wore a gown of deep sapphire, her mask adorned with peacock feathers. For once, she felt beautiful rather than merely appropriate. "The mysterious Duchess emerges from her tower," a warm voice said beside her. She turned to find a man in a simple black domino, his mask not quite concealing his amused hazel eyes. She recognized him as Dr. James Whitmore, a physician who had been entertaining the company with stories of his work in London's charitable hospitals. "Hardly a tower, Doctor." "Whitmore, more of a very comfortable prison." His smile faded slightly. "Forgive me, that was thoughtless." "No, Eleanor stopped, surprised at her own candor. "I apologize. That was inappropriate." "Was it honest?" She met his gaze. "Yes." They danced. They talked. For the first time in 3 years, Eleanor felt seen, truly seen, by another person. Dr. Whitmore spoke to her as an equal, asked her opinions, laughed at her observations. There was nothing improper in their interaction, yet Eleanor felt guilty for enjoying it so thoroughly. The evening was nearly over when the scream shattered the music. It came from the terrace. Guests rushed toward the sound, and Eleanor found herself swept along in the crowd. On the stone terrace, illuminated by torches, a terrible scene unfolded. A man, later identified as a dismissed servant with grievances against Lady Catherine, had somehow infiltrated the ball. He stood wild-eyed, a long dagger in his hand, shouting incoherently about injustice and revenge. Security moved toward him, but he was faster. He lunged not at Lady Catherine, but at the small figure standing near the terrace doors. A child, Lady Catherine's 7-year-old nephew, who had sneaked down to watch the dancing. Time fractured into crystalline moments, the blade arcing downward, the child's frozen terror. Eleanor's body moving before her mind could catch up. She threw herself forward, her arms wrapping around the boy, turning her back to the attacker. The impact came, not the blade itself, but the man's weight as he collided with her. She felt a burning line of fire across her shoulder blade, heard shouting, felt hands pulling her away. The ballroom erupted into chaos. The attacker was subdued. The child was crying but unharmed. And Eleanor, still in her sapphire gown, felt warmth spreading across her back, wet and sticky and wrong. "Get a physician," someone shouted. Dr. Whitmore was already there, easing her down onto a chair, his hands gentle but urgent as he examined the wound. "It's not deep, thank God, but it needs stitching. Lady Catherine, I need clean linens and hot water. Now." Eleanor felt strangely detached, as though watching the scene from a great distance. The pain was building, but more overwhelming was the realization of what she had done. She had acted without thought, without hesitation, for a child who wasn't even her own. "You saved him," Lady Catherine whispered, tears streaming down her face. "You saved my nephew. Is the boy truly unharmed?" Eleanor managed. "Thanks to you, yes." "Oh, my dear Duchess, you're a hero." Eleanor didn't feel heroic. She felt tired and increasingly aware of the burning pain across her back. "We must send word to the Duke," someone said. "No," Eleanor said quickly, too quickly. "There's no need to alarm him, Doctor. Whitmore says the wound isn't serious." But Lady Catherine was already dispatching a messenger. "Your husband must be informed immediately. He'll want to come to you." Eleanor closed her eyes. Sebastian would come because duty demanded it. Not because he cared. He would arrive, ensure she was properly cared for, and return to his business in Manchester. The thought was more painful than the knife wound. Dr. Whitmore worked efficiently, stitching the gash, while Eleanor bit down on a leather strap to keep from crying out. When it was done, he bandaged her shoulder carefully. "You'll need to rest for several days, no exertion. The wound must be kept clean." His eyes were kind. "That was remarkably brave, Your Grace. Or remarkably foolish. Sometimes they're the same thing." Adieu. They moved her to a guest chamber, and Beatrice stayed with her through the night, holding her hand when the pain made sleep impossible. In the grey hours before dawn, Eleanor allowed herself to cry. Not from physical pain, but from the sudden, overwhelming loneliness that crashed over her. She had thrown herself in front of a blade for a child. Would anyone ever do the same for her? Would Sebastian? She knew the answer, and it broke something inside her that had been cracking for 3 years. By the time Sebastian Ashford's carriage thundered up the drive of Willowmere 36 hours later, Eleanor had convinced herself she felt nothing. She had built her walls back up, brick by careful brick. She was not prepared for the man who burst into her chamber. Sebastian Ashford had ridden through 2 nights without stopping, changing horses at every posting inn, his mind a maelstrom of images he couldn't banish. Eleanor, blood, a blade meant for a child. When the messenger had reached him in Manchester, he had been in the middle of a crucial negotiation regarding a textile mill investment. He had left immediately, abandoning the deal without a second thought. The men he'd been meeting with had stared in astonishment. The cold Duke of Ashford, who never allowed emotion to interfere with business, had gone pale as death and walked out mid-sentence. Now standing in the doorway of the guest chamber at Willowmere, Sebastian felt something he hadn't experienced in years: fear. Eleanor sat propped against pillows, her left shoulder heavily bandaged, her face pale but composed. She looked small in the large bed, fragile in a way that made his chest constrict painfully. "Your Grace," she said formally, as though he were a stranger, "there was no need for you to interrupt your business. As you can see, I'm quite well." He crossed the room in 3 strides, stopping at her bedside, his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. "You were stabbed. Barely a scratch, according to Dr. Whitmore. You threw yourself in front of a blade. The blade was aimed at a child. You could have been killed." His voice came out harsher than he intended, roughened by the terror that had gripped him for 2 days. Eleanor's composure finally cracked, just slightly. Would it have mattered? The question hung between them like a chasm. Sebastian stared at her, this woman he had married 3 years ago and systematically ignored. He saw, as if for the first time, the delicate line of her jaw, the intelligence in her dark eyes, the quiet strength in the set of her shoulders, despite her injury. He saw the loneliness he had carved into her with his indifference. Of course it would matter, he said, but the words came too late, too uncertain. Eleanor looked away. You should return to Manchester. Your business. Damn the business! The vehemence in his voice surprised them both. Do you think I care about textile mills when you're lying here injured? You've never cared before. The words were soft, but they landed like blows. Sebastian felt each one, felt the truth of them. Eleanor, please don't. She held up her hand. I'm tired, Your Grace. The physician says I need rest. He wanted to argue, to explain something he didn't understand himself. Instead, he nodded stiffly. I'll be staying at Willowmere until you're well enough to travel. We'll return to Ashford Manor together. That's not necessary. It is to me. He left before she could protest further, before he could see the tears that threatened at the corners of her eyes. In the corridor, he encountered Dr. Whitmore, who had been checking on his patient regularly. Your Grace, I'm glad you've arrived. The Duchess is recovering well, though she'll need careful monitoring for the next week to ensure no infection sets in. Tell me exactly what happened. Sebastian's voice was controlled, but his hands were still clenched. Dr. Whitmore recounted the events of the masquerade ball. As he described Eleanor's unhesitating courage, her immediate instinct to protect a child she barely knew, Sebastian felt something shift fundamentally inside him. She didn't think, Dr. Whitmore concluded. She simply acted. It was the most selfless thing I've ever witnessed. Selfless, the word echoed in Sebastian's mind. When had he ever been selfless? When had he ever thought of anyone's needs beyond his own? He had married Eleanor to secure his lineage and silence society's gossip about his reclusive habits. He had gotten her with child to produce an heir. He had provided for her materially while starving her emotionally. And she had accepted it all with grace and dignity, never complaining, never demanding more than he was willing to give. Until now, when she had nearly died, and he had realized with devastating clarity that he had wasted 3 years. Over the following days, Sebastian remained at Willowmere, much to the surprise of the other guests. He visited Eleanor's chamber morning and evening, bringing books from Lady Catherine's library, sitting quietly while she rested, engaging in careful conversation when she felt strong enough. Eleanor didn't know what to make of this new Sebastian. He was attentive, almost gentle, asking about her comfort, her pain, her needs. It was disorienting, like learning a familiar room had been rearranged in the dark. "Why are you really here?" she asked one evening, when the pain medication had loosened her usual restraint. Sebastian set down the book he'd been reading aloud. Poetry, surprisingly, which he read well. "Because you're my wife. I've been your wife for 3 years. You've never shown this concern before." He was quiet for a long moment. "No, I haven't. So why now? Guilt, perhaps." He met her eyes. "Or perhaps I've been blind, and I'm only now beginning to see." Eleanor's heart beat faster, but she forced herself to remain calm. "See what? That I've treated you abominably. That you deserved far better than I've given you. That you're—" He paused, seeming to struggle with words. "Remarkable." Tears pricked her eyes. "Don't. Please don't say kind things simply because I was injured. I'd rather have your honest indifference than false sentiment. It's not false." He leaned forward, his expression more open than she'd ever seen it. "Eleanor, when I received the message that you'd been hurt, I felt something I haven't allowed myself to feel in years. Terror. Absolute terror at the thought of losing you. You never had me to lose." The words were cruel, but true. Sebastian flinched as though she'd struck him. "No," he admitted quietly. "I suppose I didn't, but I'd like to try, if you'll allow it." Eleanor closed her eyes, exhausted and confused, and afraid to hope. "I don't know if I can. I understand." He stood, preparing to leave. At the door, he turned back. "But I'm not giving up, Eleanor, not anymore." After he left, Eleanor lay in the darkness, her shoulder throbbing, her heart in turmoil. She had spent 3 years building walls to protect herself from the pain of Sebastian's indifference. Now he was asking her to tear them down, to risk that pain again. She didn't know if she was brave enough. Outside her door, Sebastian leaned against the wall, his eyes closed. He had spent 3 years in emotional isolation, convinced it was safer than vulnerability. Now he understood what he'd lost. The question was whether it was too late to reclaim it. The journey back to Ashford Manor was accomplished in careful stages, with frequent stops to ensure Eleanor's comfort. Sebastian had commissioned a specially modified carriage with extra cushioning and springs to minimize jolting. He rode inside with her rather than on horseback, ready to assist if she needed anything. Eleanor found his attentiveness both touching and unsettling. She had grown accustomed to his absence. His presence was a constant reminder of what she had longed for and learned to live without. "You're staring," she said one afternoon, catching his gaze for the 3rd time in an hour. "I'm ensuring you're comfortable." "I'm fine. The wound is healing well." Nevertheless, he didn't look away. They arrived at Ashford Manor on a grey November afternoon. To Eleanor's surprise, the entire household staff was assembled to greet them, and Sebastian himself helped her from the carriage with a gentleness that made her throat tight. "Welcome home, Your Grace," Morrison said warmly. "We're all tremendously relieved to see you safely returned." Eleanor realized with a start that the servants genuinely cared. She had been so focused on Sebastian's indifference that she hadn't noticed the quiet affection of the people who served her daily. That evening, as she rested in her chambers, there was a knock at the door. Sebastian entered, carrying a small bundle. "I thought you might like to see Thomas before he's put to bed." Eleanor's breath caught. Sebastian had never brought their son to her before. That had always been the nurse's duty. Thomas, now a sturdy 18-month-old with his father's dark hair and his mother's eyes, reached for her with a delighted cry. "Mama!" She gathered him carefully, mindful of her shoulder, breathing in his sweet baby scent. Sebastian sat in the chair beside her bed, watching them with an expression she couldn't quite read. "He's grown so much," she whispered. "He asks for you constantly. I didn't realize—" Sebastian's voice trailed off. "Didn't realize what? How much he loves you. How much he needs you." He paused. "How much I've kept you from him with my arrangements." Eleanor looked up sharply. It was true. Sebastian had insisted on a nurse, on scheduled feedings and visits, on all the formal structures that kept mother and child at a proper aristocratic distance. "I'd like to change that," Sebastian continued, "if you're willing. I thought perhaps Thomas could take his meals in the family dining room with us, and spend his afternoons in the drawing room rather than confined to the nursery. You want him underfoot?" Eleanor couldn't hide her surprise. "I want him to know his parents. Both of us." Sebastian reached out hesitantly, touching Thomas's dark curls. The boy grabbed his father's finger with a giggle. "I want to be more than a distant figure he sees once a week." Eleanor felt tears threaten again. They came so easily lately. "I would like that very much." Over the following weeks, Ashford Manor transformed. Thomas's laughter echoed through corridors that had been silent for years. Sebastian began taking his meals with Eleanor, and their conversations gradually moved beyond polite formalities to genuine exchanges of ideas and opinions. Eleanor discovered that her husband was not cold, but guarded. He had lost his parents young, had been raised by a stern uncle who valued duty above all else. He had learned to suppress emotion as weakness, to maintain distance as protection. "I thought if I didn't care, I couldn't be hurt," he admitted one evening over dinner. "It seemed logical. And lonely," Eleanor said softly, "unbearably lonely." He met her eyes. "I just didn't realize it until I thought I might lose you." The physical distance between them was closing, but Eleanor still felt the emotional chasm. Sebastian was trying. She could see that, but 3 years of neglect couldn't be erased in a few weeks of attentiveness. Then came the evening that changed everything. Eleanor had recovered enough to resume light activities. She was in the music room, playing the pianoforte, something she hadn't done in months. The piece was melancholy, full of longing. She didn't hear Sebastian enter. When the music ended, his voice came from behind her. "I didn't know you played so beautifully." She turned, startled. "I used to play often before I made you feel unwelcome in your own home." He crossed to the piano, his expression pained. "Eleanor, I need to tell you something. I need you to understand why I've been the way I've been." She waited, her hands still on the keys. "When I was 20, I fell in love." The words came with difficulty. "Her name was Catherine. She was the daughter of a neighboring earl, and I thought we would marry. I was young enough to believe in such things." Eleanor's chest tightened, but she remained silent. She accepted another man's proposal, someone wealthier with a better title. She told me she had been amusing herself with me, that she had never truly cared. Sebastian's jaw clenched. "I swore I would never be that vulnerable again. I would marry for practical reasons, maintain emotional distance, protect myself." "So you married me," Eleanor said quietly. "Yes. And I told myself it was better this way, cleaner, safer." He moved closer. "But I was wrong, Eleanor. I was a coward. I let one woman's betrayal poison everything that came after. I punished you for someone else's sins." "Sebastian, let me finish, please." He knelt beside the piano bench, taking her hands in his. "When I thought you might die, when I imagined a world without you in it, I realized something. I realized that I had been given something precious, a good, kind, intelligent woman who deserved to be cherished, and I had thrown it away out of fear. I had been so busy protecting myself from pain that I had caused pain instead." Eleanor's tears fell freely now. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I'm asking for a chance, a real chance. Not as the cold, distant husband I've been, but as the man I want to become. For you, for Thomas, for us." His grey eyes were intense, pleading. "I know I don't deserve it. I know I've wasted 3 years. But if you'll allow me, I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you." Eleanor looked at this man, her husband, the father of her child, the person who had caused her so much loneliness, and saw genuine remorse, genuine hope. She saw the walls he had built around himself crumbling, saw him offering her the vulnerability he had protected for so long. It would be easy to refuse, to protect her own heart the way he had protected his. But Eleanor had never chosen the easy path. She had thrown herself in front of a blade for a child. Perhaps she could risk her heart for the possibility of love. "I can't promise to forget the past," she said slowly, "and I can't promise this will be easy. I'm not asking for easy. I'm asking for a chance." She touched his face, feeling the tension in his jaw, the hope in his eyes. "Then yes, we can try." Sebastian released a breath he seemed to have been holding for weeks. He leaned forward, pressing his forehead to hers in a gesture of such tenderness that Eleanor's heart ached. "Thank you," he whispered. "I won't waste this, Eleanor. I swear it." And for the first time in 3 years, Eleanor believed him. Winter settled over Ashford Manor, but inside warmth bloomed. Sebastian courted his own wife with a determination that would have been amusing if it weren't so earnest. He brought her flowers from the hothouse, commissioned a new pianoforte with superior tone, spent evenings reading aloud while she embroidered. More importantly, he talked to her. He shared his thoughts on estate management, asked her opinions on investments, discussed books and politics and philosophy. Eleanor discovered that her husband had a sharp mind and a dry wit that emerged when he allowed himself to relax. They took walks through the winter gardens, Sebastian's arm supporting her as she regained her strength. They played with Thomas, building block towers and reading picture books. They began to build something neither had expected, friendship. But Eleanor was still cautious. She allowed Sebastian closer, but kept her deepest heart guarded. She had been hurt too deeply to surrender completely without proof that this change was permanent. Sebastian sensed her hesitation and didn't push. He was patient, consistent, demonstrating through daily actions that his transformation was genuine. One snowy evening in December, Eleanor was in the library when she overheard voices from the corridor. Sebastian was speaking with Morrison. "I need you to arrange something for me," Sebastian was saying. "I want to host a Christmas ball. A proper one, with guests from London and the surrounding counties." "A ball, Your Grace?" Morrison sounded surprised. Sebastian had never shown interest in entertaining. "Yes, I want Eleanor to have a chance to shine. I want people to see her as I've come to see her, as remarkable. And I want her to know that I'm proud to have her as my wife, that I'm not hiding her away anymore." Eleanor's hand went to her mouth. She slipped away before they could discover her eavesdropping, her heart full. The ball preparations consumed the household. Sebastian insisted on consulting Eleanor about every detail, making it clear that this was her event, her triumph. He commissioned a new gown for her, deep emerald silk that made her eyes luminous. On the night of the ball, Eleanor stood at the top of the grand staircase, looking down at the transformed manor. Candles blazed, music played, and guests filled the rooms with laughter and conversation. Sebastian appeared at her side, devastatingly handsome in formal black. He offered his arm. "Ready, my Duchess?" "I think so." They descended together, and Eleanor felt the eyes of the assembled guests upon them. She heard the whispers, surprise at the cold Duke's obvious devotion to his wife, speculation about the change in their relationship. Sebastian led her onto the dance floor for the opening waltz. As they moved together, he leaned close. "You're the most beautiful woman here. You're required to say that. I'm required to say nothing. I'm choosing to say it, because it's true." His hand tightened on her waist. "Eleanor, I need you to know something." "What?" "I love you." She stumbled slightly, and his arm steadied her. "Sebastian, I know it's too soon. I know I haven't earned the right to say it yet, but it's true. Somewhere in these past months, I've fallen completely, irrevocably in love with my own wife." He smiled, that rare, genuine smile that transformed his face. "I thought you should know." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything. I just needed you to hear it." They finished the dance in silence, but Eleanor's mind was reeling. She had wanted those words for 3 years. Now that she had them, she didn't know if she could trust them. Later, she stood on the terrace, needing air and space to think. Dr. Whitmore found her there. He had been among the invited guests. "Your Grace, you look troubled." "Dr. Whitmore, I'm fine, just overwhelmed." "The Duke seems quite devoted." His tone was carefully neutral. "Yes, he's changed, or perhaps I'm finally seeing who he really is." "And that frightens you." Eleanor looked at him in surprise. "How did you know?" "Because loving someone who hurt you requires tremendous courage, even more than throwing yourself in front of a blade." He smiled kindly. "But from what I've observed, the Duke's feelings are genuine, and you, Your Grace, deserve to be loved." "Do I?" "Without question." Indeed, after he left, Eleanor remained on the terrace, thinking about courage. She'd been brave when it mattered for others. Perhaps it was time to be brave for herself. She found Sebastian in his study after the last guests had departed. He looked up from his desk, surprise and pleasure crossing his face. "Eleanor, I thought you'd retired. I wanted to talk to you." She closed the door behind her, her heart pounding. "About what you said during the waltz." His expression became guarded. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." "You didn't. You made me hopeful and terrified." She crossed to his desk. "I've spent 3 years protecting myself from you, learning not to want what I couldn't have. And now you're offering me everything I dreamed of, and I'm afraid." "Afraid of what?" "That this is temporary, that you'll wake up one day and remember you don't actually need me, that I'll open my heart completely and you'll crush it." Sebastian stood, moving around the desk to take her hands. "I can't promise I'll be perfect. I'm still learning how to be the husband you deserve. But I can promise that this is real, Eleanor. What I feel for you is real, and I will spend every day proving it to you until you believe it." Eleanor looked into his eyes and saw the truth there. She saw love, genuine and deep. She saw commitment. She saw the man she had fallen in love with despite herself, despite everything. "I love you too," she whispered. "I've loved you for longer than I should have, longer than was wise, and it terrified me because you didn't love me back. I was a fool." "Yes, you were," she smiled through her tears. "But perhaps we both were. Perhaps we both needed to learn how to be brave." Sebastian pulled her close, mindful of her still healing shoulder, and kissed her with a tenderness that made her knees weak. It was their first real kiss, full of promise and possibility. When they finally drew apart, Eleanor rested her head against his chest, listening to his heartbeat. "No more walls?" Sebastian asked softly. "No more walls," she agreed. And for the first time since their wedding day, Eleanor truly felt like a wife, like someone loved. Spring came to Ashford Manor with an explosion of colour. The gardens that had seemed so cold and formal now burst with life, roses and lavender, hollyhocks and sweet peas. Eleanor walked among them with Thomas toddling at her side and Sebastian's hand warm in hers. 6 months had passed since the Christmas ball, 6 months of growing closer, of building trust, of learning to love openly. The change in Sebastian was profound and permanent. He had become the man she had always hoped he could be, attentive, affectionate, present. More than that, he had become a true father to Thomas. He spent hours with their son, teaching him to ride his first pony, reading him stories, carrying him on his shoulders through the estate. The cold Duke of Ashford had melted completely, and in his place was a man who laughed freely and loved deeply. "I received a letter from Lady Catherine," Eleanor said as they paused by the fountain. "She's invited us to visit Willowmere this summer. She wants to see how well I've healed, and to meet the transformed Duke, no doubt." Sebastian's tone was wry. "I imagine the gossip has reached her. Everyone is talking about us, the cold Duke and his Duchess, suddenly inseparable. Let them talk." He pulled her close, kissing her temple. "I don't care what society thinks anymore. I only care about you, about us." Thomas tugged on Sebastian's coat. "Papa! Flower!" Sebastian scooped up their son, helping him pick a daisy. Eleanor watched them together, her heart full. This was what she had dreamed of, a real family, bound by love rather than duty. That evening, as they prepared for dinner, Morrison brought news that made Eleanor's breath catch. "Your Grace, there's a visitor, a Lady Catherine Ashford. She says she's the Duke's cousin." Eleanor had never heard Sebastian mention a cousin named Catherine. She looked at her husband and saw his face had gone pale. "Show her to the drawing room," Sebastian said tightly. "We'll be down shortly." After Morrison left, Eleanor touched Sebastian's arm. "Who is she?" "Catherine Ashford was Catherine Pemberton before she married my cousin Richard. She's the woman I told you about, the one who broke my engagement." Eleanor's stomach dropped. "She's here. Why?" "I don't know, but we'll face her together." He took her hand. "You're my wife, Eleanor. My love. Nothing she says or does can change that." They descended to the drawing room, where a beautiful blonde woman in an expensive travelling dress stood examining the portraits. She turned as they entered, her smile practiced and cold. "Sebastian, how wonderful to see you after all these years." "Catherine," Sebastian's voice was ice, "why are you here? Can't a cousin visit family?" Her eyes slid to Eleanor, assessing and dismissive. "You must be the Duchess." "How quaint." Eleanor felt the insult but refused to react. She had faced down a blade. She could certainly face down a spiteful woman. "Lady Catherine," she said coolly, "this is unexpected." "I'm sure it is. I've been hearing such interesting rumors about Sebastian's transformation. The cold Duke, suddenly playing at devoted husband. I had to see it for myself." Sebastian stepped forward, his body slightly in front of Eleanor's. Protective. "You've seen it. Now you can leave." "So hostile, Sebastian. I remember when you used to write me poetry." "I was young and foolish. I'm neither anymore." Catherine's smile sharpened. "No? Then perhaps you've forgotten that Richard died last year. I'm a widow now, Sebastian, free. just as you once wanted me to be." The implication hung in the air like poison. Eleanor felt her chest tighten, old insecurities rising. But Sebastian laughed, a genuine, incredulous laugh. "You think I would want you now, after everything? We were in love once." "No, Catherine, I was in love. You were amusing yourself. There's a difference." He took Eleanor's hand, lacing their fingers together. "And even if you had genuinely cared for me back then, it wouldn't matter now. I have everything I want, everything I need. I have Eleanor." Catherine's composure cracked slightly. "The Baron's daughter? Really, Sebastian, you could do so much better." "There is no better. Eleanor is brave, kind, intelligent, and selfless. She threw herself in front of a blade to save a child. She's been patient with my failings and generous with her forgiveness. She's the mother of my son and the love of my life." Sebastian's voice was firm, final. "You, Catherine, are a memory I've outgrown. I thank you for rejecting me all those years ago, because it led me to her." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, but these were tears of joy. Sebastian had just declared his love for her in front of the woman who had once broken his heart, and there was no hesitation in his voice, no doubt. Catherine's face flushed with anger and humiliation. "You'll regret this." "The only thing I regret is wasting years of my marriage because I was afraid of becoming the lovesick fool you once made me. But I'm not afraid anymore." He looked at Eleanor, his eyes soft. "Love doesn't make you weak. It makes you stronger." Catherine left in a fury, and Eleanor and Sebastian stood in the drawing room, hands still clasped. "Did you mean all of that?" Eleanor asked softly. "Every word." "She has no power over me anymore, Eleanor. You're the only woman I see, the only woman I want." Eleanor threw her arms around him, mindful of her long-heeled shoulder, and kissed him with all the love and relief and joy in her heart. "I love you," she whispered against his lips. "I love you so much, and I love you, my brave, beautiful Duchess, my true love." Later, as they sat in the nursery watching Thomas sleep, Sebastian pulled Eleanor close. "Do you remember what you asked me once? Whether it would have mattered if you had died?" Eleanor nodded, remembering that painful conversation at Willowmere. "It would have destroyed me," Sebastian said quietly. "Losing you would have destroyed me. You're not just my wife, Eleanor, you're my heart, the best part of me." "You're the best part of me too," Eleanor replied. "Even when you were cold, even when you hurt me, I loved you. I couldn't help it. I'll spend the rest of my life being worthy of that love." And he did. The years that followed were filled with joy. More children, shared dreams, deep partnership. Sebastian never again retreated into coldness. He remained the warm, loving man he had become, and Eleanor bloomed in the light of his devotion. The story of the cold duke and the duchess who had taken a dagger for his heir became legend in society. But those who knew them best understood the real story. It wasn't the blade that had saved them, but the courage to love despite fear, to forgive despite pain, to choose each other every day. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Sebastian gave Eleanor a portrait he had commissioned. It showed the three of them, Sebastian, Eleanor, and Thomas, in the rose garden, laughing together. But in the corner, almost hidden, was a small detail, a single dagger transformed into a garden trowel, planting seeds. "From death to life," Sebastian explained. "From fear to love. That's our story." Eleanor kissed him, her heart full. "No. Our story is that love was always there. We just had to be brave enough to claim it." And in the nursery down the hall, their children slept peacefully, heirs not just to a dukedom, but to a legacy of courage, forgiveness, and true love. Thank you for listening to this story. If you enjoyed it, please click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments which part of the world you're listening from. I want to know how far this story has traveled.